Hi, I'm Ben, and this is Demystifying Loops in Smart Contracts. First, a special thank you to my collaborators, Yanju, Yu, Isil, and Shuvendu. Without their hard work, this paper would not have been possible. So, why demystify loops in smart contracts? Well, indeed, smart contracts are hot right now. So why are they hot? Smart contracts are code which execute a program on the blockchain. However, these aren't just arbitrary programs. For one, they often facilitate important financial transactions. Thus, mistakes are costly. For instance, the DAO hack in 2016 resulted in $50 million being stolen. Due to the importance of smart contract correctness, there has been a boom in smart contract analysis tools in the past few years. However, many of these tools make the assumption that loops are rare in smart contracts. Is this true? What types of loops do appear in smart contracts? We believe a better understanding of how loops are used in smart contracts will be especially useful for developers of analysis tools, who can use this information to better tailor their tools to the types of loops which actually appear in smart contracts. Thus, our goal is to explore how loops are used in smart contracts. In pursuit of this goal, we did the following. First, we performed a basic static analysis to determine common syntactic and semantic features of loops in smart contracts. Second, we clustered contract loops based on their common semantic features. Third, we used clustering to develop a domain-specific language called console to capture common smart contract loop behaviors. Fourth, we built a program synthesizer Solus, which produces programs in our DSL console equivalent to an input smart contract loop. Finally, we used our synthesizer to evaluate how well the console DSL captures real smart contract loop behaviors. So, to start, I'll explain a bit about the static analysis we conducted to extract common syntactic and semantic features. So, for all of our analyses, we used a total of more than 22,000 contracts, which we mined from Etherscan. To conduct the analysis, we fed these contracts the static analyzer Slither. So, what did we find from our syntactic analysis? Well, our goal was to answer the following three questions. One, are loops actually rare in smart contracts, as many analysis tools assume? Two, how complex are the loops that do occur in smart contracts? And three, what are other common syntactic properties of loops? So, first, are loops rare? Well, not really. 20% of smart contracts have at least one loop. Moreover, 50% of larger contracts, that is, contracts with more than 200 lines of code, have at least one loop. Second, how complex are loops? So, loops are actually mostly quite small, containing on average only 2 lines of code. Furthermore, nested loops are quite rare, comprising less than 5% of all loops. Interestingly, despite being mostly small, more than 1/3 of all loops contain some sort of control flow construct. So, for example, an if statement or a continue statement. And finally, what are some other common syntactic properties of loops? Well, first, the vast majority, 88%, of loops involve a collection. Second, 3/4 of loops involve writes, that is, side effects on the contract state. Loops without writes include loops with things like requires, events, and transfers. Which brings us to the next point that 8% of loops involve a transfer, which sends money from one address to another. Finally, 22% of loops involve function calls, excluding safe math calls and built-in function calls like transfer. This finding indicates that inter-procedural analysis is not necessary for the majority of smart contract loops. The analysis results pictured here are just a subset of the total findings from our analysis. I encourage viewers to check out the paper for a full discussion of the syntactic analysis. So, those are some of the notable syntactic properties extracted by static analysis, but what are the semantic properties? The semantic properties we extracted were dependence properties over program variables. That is, properties asserting one variable's value at the end of the loop is dependent on another variable's value. We broke these semantic properties down according to whether or not a value is a scalar or a collection, and whether a value is used as a key to a collection, that is an index, or a value to a collection. On the whole, we did not find that any particular dependency type was far more prevalent than the others, though we did find that the most common dependency was between collections. So, now we've given a quick overview of some of the findings from our static analysis. We will now move on to explain how we use that static analysis to group contract loops according to similar semantic features. In order to perform clustering, we first separated all loops of size 1. We did not consider larger loops in the clustering because overlaps in their behavior made clustering difficult. We then converted each loop into a dependency graph, which exposed many semantic features similar to those discussed earlier. In order to extract features for clustering, we used 37 features of the dependency graph. An example of the types of features we included is the number of different types of nodes which are written to or read from. We explain all of the 37 features in an appendix in the paper. Finally, we use standard k-means clustering with 6 clusters to obtain the clusters pictured on the right. In order to make sense of this clustering, we randomly sampled 10 programs from each cluster and manually searched for common semantic behaviors. We found the following common behaviors, many of which are similar to functional programming concepts. The first behavior is fold. A fold is an accumulation over a collection. For example, the example shown here is a fold over the first 10 elements of a collection M using plus as the folding operator. The second identified behavior is a map. A map applies a function to elements of a collection. In this example, the first 10 elements of the collection M are each multiplied by 10. The third identified behavior is require. Require simply enforces a predicate over a collection. In this example, the require enforces that all elements of M are greater than 0. The fourth common behavior is a loose combination of loops which perform complex arithmetic operations over scalars. The loop to the right shows an example of one such program. As you may recall from the analysis section earlier, such loops, that is loops with no collections, are not very common, and this particular cluster only comprises 2% of the total loops. Finally, to avoid biasing due to only sampling size 1 loops in the clustering, as explained earlier, we also sampled loops with more than one statement in their bodies. In this sampling, we identified the zip behavior, which pairwise aggregates collections. In this example, the first 10 elements of collections M1 and M2 are summed and assigned to M1. So, we use this clustering to identify some common behaviors of loops in smart contracts. We now propose a domain-specific language which captures these behaviors. Note that due to time constraints, I'll only very briefly cover the basics of the DSL. I encourage interested viewers to see the paper for more details. So, our DSL console is pictured on the right. A console program is a sequence of statements S separated by semicolons. A statement can be one of 3 things. First, a batch transfer, which, as you may recall, describes sending money to a set of recipients. In particular, the transfer operator sends the ether amounts in the collection M2 to each recipient in collection M1, whose key satisfies the predicate fee. Second, a statement can be a require, which enforces a precondition fee 2 over all elements of collection M, whose keys satisfy fee 1. Third, a statement can be an assignment of an expression E to a program variable V. So, what can an expression be? Well, it can be one of the operators we discussed before. That is a map, which applies a function f to a collection M, a fold, which aggregates the elements of a collection M using a function f and initial value I, or a zip, which pairwise aggregates collections M1 and M2 using function f. You may also notice the word nested all over the place, as I've highlighted on the right. These nested operators are variants of the operators I've already discussed, which indicate the use of nested collection accesses. For example, consider the program shown below. The console equivalent of this loop is given in the comment above the loop. In this case, the map nested operator adds 5 to each element of the collection M1, whose key corresponds to the first 10 elements of the collection M2. In our analysis, we found use of nested collection accesses, such as this, were quite common, and hence we included nested variants in the DSL. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of the console DSL. we now briefly explain our synthesis toolchain, which we use to synthesize console summaries. Our synthesis toolchain, Solus, takes a solidity loop as input and produces a console summary as output. In order to do this, it uses enumerative type-directed search to iteratively propose candidate console summaries, that is programs, until the correct summary is found or a time limit is reached. We built a bounded model checker in Rosette, which leverages Rosette's SMT encoding facilities, as well as its symbolic evaluation engine to determine if a candidate console summary matches the original solidity loop, unrolled up to some bound. As is common in program synthesis, the search space of candidate console summaries increases exponentially in the size of summaries being considered. In order to combat this, we introduce a number of optimizations which prune the search space, which you can check out in detail in the paper. One notable optimization, which I will briefly mention here, is what we call compositional synthesis. In compositional synthesis, we synthesize partial summaries, that is, console programs which represent a subset of a loop's behavior, and compose them together. This dramatically reduces the search space, but means some loops which have complete console summaries can no longer be synthesized. We found in practice that these loops which cannot be synthesized are rare, and therefore we believe the optimization is worth it. So, given this synthesis pipeline, what specific questions do we want to answer about loops and smart contracts? Here are the 3 questions we wanted to answer with our evaluation. First, what percentage of real-world smart contract loops are expressible in console? Second, what is the relative frequency of console constructs? What are the most and least common constructs? Finally, what loops can be synthesized by our synthesizer? In order to answer this question, we extracted 1,220 loops from 1,200 smart contracts. Notably, we excluded loops which cannot be analyzed by Solus, which indicates loops which includes loops which contain things like user-defined constructs and multidimensional arrays. In total, our benchmarks comprise 40% of the loops from the 1,200 contracts. Finally, we imposed a 2-hour timeout on the synthesizer per loop. So, our results were as follows. First, what percentage of loops are expressible in console? 56% of loops have a partial or complete summary in console. Recall, a partial summary represents only a subset of the behavior of a loop, while a complete summary is equivalent to the original loop. Of the 56% which could be summarized, 86% were complete, i.e. equivalent to the original loop. Second, which console constructs are most and least common? The graph below shows the relative frequency of console constructs. The map construct is the most common, followed closely by the require construct. It should be noted that the require construct is likely overrepresented in this data, as require statements which enforce a conjunction of preconditions are expressed in the console DSL as multiple require constructs for each conjunct. The least common construct is transfer, which is not that surprising given that our earlier analysis showed that only 8% of loops contain calls to transfer. The last 2 bars in the graph compare the frequency of nested versus non-nested versions of the operators. Recall that nested operators represent nested collection accesses. Interestingly, nested variants are more common, indicating these variants are crucial to include in the DSL. Finally, what loops cannot be synthesized by Solus? As explained earlier, our compositional synthesis optimization results in incompleteness, meaning some loops which can be summarized in console will not be able to be synthesized by Solus. Additionally, complex arithmetic loops, like those discussed briefly in the clustering section, cannot be expressed in console. This is by design, as these loops are relatively rare, and there are a number of existing techniques for handling loops of this kind in standard analysis tools. Finally, complex nested loops can sometimes be unexpressible in console. However, as discussed in the analysis section, nested loops are very uncommon. We identify 3 possible threats to validity in this work. First, it's possible that our benchmark selection is not representative of real-world smart contract loops. However, given the large number and variety of contracts we used in our experiments, we believe that our benchmarks are reasonably representative. Second, it is possible that not all summaries produced by Solus were actually valid, as the bounded model checker only proves equivalence up to a bound. However, based on a manual sampling of Solus outputs, we believe the vast majority of summaries produced by Solus are in fact accurate. Finally, it is possible that our DSL console is not representative of real-world smart contracts, as it was handcrafted by us, the authors. To mitigate this concern, we created console using clustering-based sampling and evaluated its generalizability against 1220 loops from 1200 real-world smart contracts. So, in conclusion, our goal was to better understand how loops are used in smart contracts. We first explored this through static analysis, where we found many contracts contain loops, despite the assumptions of current analysis tools. However, most loops are not complex, containing on average only 2 lines of code. We then used clustering to identify a few common loop behaviors, like maps, folds, and zips. We then introduced Console, a domain-specific language which precisely captured these common smart contract loop behaviors. Finally, we built a program synthesis toolchain Solus to evaluate how well our DSL captures loop behaviors in real-world smart contracts, and found that a majority of loops can be either partially or completely summarized using Console. So, with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.